Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Tips with Kimberbell. I'm Kim and
I'm Jeanette.
Kim and Jeanette is in the house, and we're ready to talk quilting. Now, last week I did a Tuesday Tips tutorial on how to add the Kimberbell quilting borders. Right? And we mentioned in that Tuesday Tips that if you had any questions about the background quilting at all or the borders themselves, then certainly to type that in and that we would make additional Tuesday tip tutorials on that. And so that's what this week is all about. We took your questions, the most commonly asked questions. We went through and answered as many as we could later that day. So if you haven't seen that video, go back and check that out because it has a lot of good information on how to quilt your borders. But today, I thought it would be fun to get together, Jeanette.
Yes.
Any excuse to hang out with my girl, Jeanette, and talk about some of your most commonly asked questions. So I think what would be easiest is for us, we've kind of divided up what those questions are here. And what I'll do is I'll just tell you what people asked and then give you an answer. And chances are is if you had that question or if somebody else had that question, you might be thinking, oh, I was wondering that too. I'm glad they asked that. So hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of those questions and answers today. Of course, if there's anything that we're not covering, just type it in the comments below and we'll make sure and cover that. All right. So the first question, are you ready? It was this. Let's see, how do you attach the backing? Someone mentioned, I'm really curious about how this works in a whole quilt. I understand that the batting only comes up to the sewing line, but how do you attach the back of the quilt? Do you just quilt the back to the front by sewing in the ditch, or is it completely loose? Another question very similar to that is, how do we put the blocks together if we put fabric on the back? So we have an answer for you, and we'll go into more detail on a future episode of this with very step-by-step tutorials. I think that would be helpful. But the answer is yes. Whoever asked that question, we would recommend that you do what we would call stitch in the ditch. Now let me show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to take this Love Notes quilt right here, and if you are new to quilting, you know, this might be something that you go, oh, that's what they mean when stitch in the ditch. So the idea is that with the Kimberbell quilting background, you have a placement line for your batting. Now, of course, the batting is what goes in the center of your quilt. And you have an area, it's going to actually stitch so that when you go to sew these blocks together, there's no batting in the seams, which is really, really nice, right? We don't want all that bulk in the seams. So you go ahead and you do that part, but then when it's time to put the back on, you do what we would call stitch in the ditch. You make a quilt sandwich, and a quilt sandwich consists of your backing fabric on the bottom, then a layer of batting in the middle, it's your meat, if you will, and then your top. But because you already had batting in your quilting blocks, you don't need to worry about it. So just put your backing on the bottom, your quilt top facing up on top, and you know, to keep those layers together while you're waiting to stitch in that ditch, you could do a few things. I've safety pinned before. Is that
yes,
what you do?
I have safety pins.
Okay, so you could take safety pins and pin them, I don't know,
Basting
every
spray.
6 to 8 inches apart or something like that. Basting spray is another good idea, like a 505 type spray. I know there's basting powders out there that you can just sprinkle on, and then when you iron the two together, it gives a temporary adhesive without creating stickiness, I guess. So there's all kinds of ways to keep those together, and then you simply take it to your sewing machine and you do what we would call stitch in the ditch. And what the ditch is it's the areas of the blocks. Let's see if we can get a close up here. It's the areas of the blocks that connect, right? So if I'm looking between this sashing strip and this white block here, the ditch, of course, would be that seam line right there. So if you take that to your machine, just do a regular top stitch, you will be doing what we would call stitch in the ditch, and you would simply outline all of your quilt blocks. Now, you don't have to do any stitching within the block because it's already been embroidered, or it's already been quilted, I should say. But to actually attach it to the back, yes, you're going to want to stitch in the ditch.
And even on the little 2-inch squares, you wouldn't even have to go through every single one if you didn't want to. You could decide to go around 2 of them. It's just how much you want the back attached.
Yeah.
Really.
And then with this one in particular, since it's a wall hanging, you know, I'm not too concerned about all that.
No.
You know, how much I get stitched down or
you
not.
You almost could even just stitch around each row, inside each row.
There you go.
And around your sashing, and it would attach enough to the back to hold it all together.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't even have to go in between each block.
Yeah. So it's entirely up to you. You know, some people might say, well, do I need a special foot for that? You know, I always like to use a walking foot. That's just a personal preference. You certainly could do it with a regular sewing machine foot. If you do that, I would probably lengthen your stitch just a little bit so it just more easily glides over the top there through all those layers. But a walking foot is something I always recommend when I quilt. So anyway, hopefully that helps answer that question. Jeanette, what's next?
So I have a 6x10 hoop, but the file isn't pulling up. How do I know what size of hoop I need for the quilting backgrounds? So we mentioned this briefly in our first video that it was really hard to name the files, like 4.5 by 6.5. How do I get that, you know, in really short and make it look
file name structure,
right? And make it understand that that's half. So the name of the file is actually the finished size of the block, and by finished size of the block, that's what it's sewn in the quilt. When it's sewn in the quilt and it's finished, that's the finished size.
So if you had cut a 4.5 by 6.5 inch block, it's going to finish at
4 by 6.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's how you would know. We have included some more images. So the later ones, I need to go update the directions on the earlier ones to make sure we have the column for the embroidery file. But the later ones have that in them. And there's now picture.
You're talking about the embroidery field
size. The embroidery
size.
field size. Just to make it more clear about the embroidery field size.
Now, Jeanette, I'm going to ask you a question here. Because I know someone out there is thinking this. If it says I need a 6x10 hoop, it's the 6x10 finished size.
Yes.
And I might be thinking, well, perfect. I have a 6x10 hoop, but for some reason it's not pulling up. Why is that, Jeanette?
It's because the embroidery field is 1/2 inch larger in each direction. So the file itself is 6.5 by 10.5. So you'd have to check your hoop to see what the embroidery field of your hoop really is.
So you may need to bump up.
You might have to get a bigger hoop.
But there is a workaround, right?
If you have software, there's a workaround.
Yeah.
So the machine steps, there's 5 machine steps in every file. The first and second, place and tack down your batting. But the third and fourth steps are your fabric tack down. So you could take those steps out.
That's what makes it
It's the
larger,
biggest.
Right?
Yes. So some of the blocks will actually still be a little bit bigger than 6x10 because of the quilting that goes into the seam. But it would still fit in most 6x10 hoops by removing that outer file, but you'd have to be really careful when you put your fabric down, though. You'd really have to tape it into place and make sure it's really secure before you did the quilting on top of that.
So would you consider like just taping it in place?
You could tape
something
it in
like
place.
that, because what files 3 or steps 3 and 4 are doing really are just tacking down that fabric so it doesn't shift.
Yes.
So if you took care of 3 and 4 and eliminated those steps, you certainly could use the smaller hoop, right?
You could.
Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Of course, if you have any further questions on that, you just let us know. Okay. So the next question, why do you add 2 inches to the length of the border but not the width? Please explain why you are worried about it shrinking on the length of the border but not the width. And there's a good answer for that. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, last week when I showed how to do the borders, I was using the example of the Twilight Boulevard bench pillow. And I mentioned that on the length of your fabric, you want to add about 2 inches of fabric before you start quilting. But we never said anything about why you wouldn't add that extra to the width. And there's a good reason for it, and I should have explained it last week, but now I get a chance to. When we're talking about widths, we're talking for borders, we're talking 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 5 inch, and 6 inch widths. They all come in one download. And because that is just such a short amount of fabric on that width, there really is no give and pull in after you're embroidering, right? But with the length of fabric, you know, you're talking about the long side of a quilt, there's going to be a lot more give or chances for give. So when we say add 2 inches, it's really more about giving yourself a little bit of wiggle room, right?
Yes.
And it's making sure that you have plenty of fabric, because then you will cut the size to the exact length of your quilt border after you've quilted.
Mm-hmm. So this actually leads right into my next question.
Yeah.
Is that we tell people to cut that 2 inches longer, but on the Twilight Boulevard pillow, if you are piecing it together, you don't have the extra 2 inches.
Yeah. So what do you do?
So you just have to be a little bit more careful about how you place it. So when we say place it with a little bit over, you got to really just make sure you're only giving yourself 1/4 of an inch extra on that first hoop. And then when you're doing the additional hoops, every time you just have to make sure that you're placing that really close next to each other, because you don't have that extra 2 inches of wiggle room. So you just have to be a little more persnickety with it.
Yeah. Okay. I like that word, persnickety with it. There you go. And you know, the other point with this is that, say on a bench pillow, say on a small project, you're really not working with a lot of fabric. So on smaller projects like that, you probably would be okay not having that full extra 2 inches to work with. But we're talking on a big quilt length, you know, there's just a lot more pull and give
and room for error
room for error. And so we just want to give you that little bit of wiggle room so that you can be sure to have enough fabric. Does that make sense? I think so. Okay. All right. And if you're going, I have no clue what you're talking about, go ahead and watch last week's Tuesday Tips with me, and it will all make more sense. All right. Is it my turn?
It's your turn.
Okay, where am I at here? When quilting?
Yeah,
okay.
Quilting.
When quilting the patchwork squares. So they're talking about the patchwork border from Twilight Boulevard last week. When quilting the patchwork squares, do you add the fusible before sewing the squares together, or after the strip is all one length? Well, I would say that's a personal preference. But what I would recommend is to sew all of your patchwork border strips together first. Then I would actually, are you ready for this? Press my seams open. I know there's debate out there on, do you press it to the side? Do you press it open? What is it? There's all camps on how to press your seams. I personally would press it open so it's nice and flat. There's no extra bulk. And then I would fuse a fusible backing to the entire strip.
To the whole length.
Yeah, that's just what I would do. What would you do, Jeanette? Does that sound good?
Yes. Honestly, I would probably go rogue and not put the fusible backing on just my border.
What?
I know,
what?
Right? We say put fusible backing on everything, but
I love fusible backing.
It is awesome. But it does, we're not adding applique to the block.
That's true.
I think I could get away without it.
That's true. That's a good point. You certainly could. So it really does come down to personal preference.
It is.
Yeah.
A lot is personal.
You know, the other thing I was going to say about the fusible backing and on a long length of fabric is that if you do put that fusible backing on it, that kind of stabilizes that fabric, don't you think? So there wouldn't be as much give or pull.
Yes.
So you decide. Do you do it or do you not? Do you press your seams flat open or do you press them to the dark side?
Right? We're both going rogue.
Totally up to you. All right. No quilt police here, for sure. All right.
So how do you add the quilting patterns for blocks that are already appliqued? So if you've already appliqued it, you're like, now you have quilting patterns. What do I do?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the quilting patterns are designed to go underneath.
Yeah.
So you'd have to make a choice if you wanted it to go on top and be stitched on top.
You could certainly do that.
You could.
I mean, before I got into machine embroidery and I would do applique quilts, there's a lot of times that I would send the applique to a long arm quilter and they would just do what we would call an all over design. And it went over the top of the applique. You're going to have more problems with that with, dimensional elements that are added to it. So again, personal preference, but definitely the recommendation would be to do it before. Yeah. Now, if you have software, again, there are ways around that. But we're trying to make these quilting background design files just as easy and slick as possible, right?
Yes.
Okay, 2 more questions. Number 7, are there registration marks to line up a second hooping for the longer borders? Well, I'm happy to tell you, no, there are no registration marks, and that's a good thing, right? Because it is so simple to line it up with the method that we show you in the step-by-step tutorial. So when you download these designs, we will give you a step-by-step tutorial on how it all lines up without registration marks, so it makes it really easy. And the other thing I was going to say about that is, watch the video. Watch the video. Last week I showed how you can line those up really easily and no fuss type of lining up, right? Yeah. And you do not need registration marks. So there we go.
Okay.
And finally,
borders. Last question. So if you use a larger hoop and do multiple strips at a time, would it be faster to leave the fabric and batting as one piece or cut it as you go? So in my head, I'm thinking about this different than you are. I'm like, one whole piece this way or one whole piece this way in your hoop. So I think for sure I would cut it into the strips.
Yes.
Because putting a whole thing over like 2 or 3 of them, then it doesn't really give you a cut line for sure on the sides. So I think I would for sure cut it in strips.
Yeah.
So in our testing, when we were trying to decide the easiest method for you guys to quilt these, we did some testing with long pieces of batting and the long strip of fabric. And we really just found that it was easier to just cut your batting in the pieces.
A little more foolproof, right?
Yes. Yeah. Less to worry about when you're moving things and attaching things, and then when you're putting it back on, when it tacked the batting down, you didn't have to worry about it catching your border that's still stuck to your batting. Yeah. It was just easier.
So we would recommend that. Yes. Certainly it's possible to do it with long strips, but I like your idea of cutting the strips.
Yes.
The way they need to be
and
cut.
For sure I would duplicate that in my hoop as many as I could go and do like 3 or 4 strips at the same time.
Well, then you'll use less stabilizer, right? Yeah.
And your quilt has 4 borders.
Yeah.
You might as well. One time.
Nice. I like it. Okay, so those were the most commonly asked questions. Hopefully we helped with that. Of course, if you have any other questions on the background quilting designs, then be sure to make a comment below and we'll go through and try to answer as many as we can. And we can also do future episodes of tips for doing background quilting. Yes. I'm really excited because you know what's coming this week? By the end of this week, you will find, are you ready? Christmas background quilting designs will be up on the website by the end of this week. So I know a lot of people are waiting for those.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of people waiting for Ginger's Kitchen. They want to do Ginger's Kitchen, bench pillow. They want to do We Whisk You a Merry Christmas. And ooh,
so cute.
We have some really fun ones. So be watching for that. Yes. You can find all the quilting backgrounds for immediate download at mykimberbell.com. And all the design, all the files are there. Everything you need is there. So anyway, I think that's all for us today, right?
Yep.
Do you have any parting words? Any words of wisdom you want to share?
No. Happy stitching.
Happy stitching. I love it. Happy stitching. Happy day. Isn't today the first day of fall?
I think so.
I think it is.
First day of autumn.
Sweater weather. Love it. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great first day of fall. And we will see you next week on Tuesday Tips with Kimberbell. Bye-bye.